What would cause a person to dance themselves to death? It seems like an odd question, but it is the one that we will be answering today. How could you move your body to the point where it breaks down? How long would it take to dance until you died? Why wouldn't you just take a break? Sit down, drink some water. Please stop dancing. Please stop before you kill yourself. These sound like absurd statements, but they are among the things being asked in Europe in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. For a period of over 100 years, multiple cities in Europe were stricken by groups of people who could not or would not stop dancing. From 1374 until 1518, large cities such as Aachen and Strasbourg were gripped in the throes of what would become known as dancing mania. If the most extreme of the accounts are to be believed, hundreds of people died during these outbreaks of spontaneous dancing. These poor people would literally dance themselves to death, to the horror and confusion of those watching. The way that it spread, and the fact that it killed, led many to start calling these incidents outbreaks of dancing plague. Instead of a traditional fever, those afflicted with the dancing plague had a fever for shaking it. The dancing plague brings new meaning to the term, shake it until you make it. But in this case, making it usually meant dancing until your heart gave out. Leaders and observers struggled to explain the maddening phenomenon. Was it divine judgment? Was it some sort of new illness? Were these people possessed by demons? Did they need absolution? Was their blood too hot? Were they bitten by a poisonous spider? No one knew for sure. And even today, modern historians have trouble pinpointing what could have caused these bizarre outbreaks. So what exactly was going on? What really is dancing mania? What caused dozens of people to dance themselves to death during the medieval period? And while terms like dancing plague and dance mania sound silly and frivolous, the consequences were deadly serious. Like most good medieval tales, dancing mania begins with a Catholic saint. During the period when dancing mania was most common, one saint was particularly popular, Saint Vitus. Saint Vitus was a legendary saint with no concrete evidence pointing to the fact that he had actually existed. Despite that, he was considered among the 14 helpers, that is, 14 prevalent saints who were regarded above the rest for their intercessory powers and healing prowess. Saint Vitus was the patron saint of epilepsy, chorea, lightning, and the bites of animals. It is no wonder Saint Vitus was so popular, as random animal attacks and lightning strikes were much graver dangers during this time than they are today. But Vitus was also the patron saint of epilepsy and chorea, involuntary movement. This is why he was celebrated with dancing, and later was associated with dancers and entertainers. On the feast day of Saint Vitus, the faithful would gather in front of his statue or effigy and dance as a sign of worship or adoration. Somewhere along the line, likely lost in the twisted horrors of the Black Death, Saint Vitus was bestowed with a new power, the power to curse people. This seemed like an odd thing for a saint to wield. After all, saints were supposed to be the paragons of good, which is why they were canonized in the first place. But now Saint Vitus was granted the extraordinary and godlike power to curse the unfaithful or the sinner. Saint Vitus's curse of choice was a bout of involuntary dancing. The first major outbreak of the dancing plague took place in the city of Aachen in the Holy Roman Empire in 1374. Seemingly out of nowhere, hundreds of people came out of their houses and gathered in the streets before beginning to dance. According to the 19th century historian Justus Friedrich Karl Hecker, the dancing went something like this. He says, quote, "They formed circles, hand in hand, and appearing to have lost all control over their senses, continued dancing, regardless of the bystanders, for hours together in wild delirium, until at length they fell to the ground in a state of exhaustion. They then complained of extreme oppression, and groaned as if the agonies of death, until they were swathed in clothes, bound tightly around their waists, upon which they again recovered, and remained free from complaint until the next attack." This was not the first appearance of the dancing plague in Europe, Sporadic accounts exist of individuals breaking out into dance in areas hit hardest by the Black Death. The dancing plague did not originate in Aachen, but it was here that the disease morphed and began to spread further and faster than ever. Aachen was the first city to see dozens of people stricken with the urge to dance and hundreds of bystanders to watch them do it. There are no records of deaths during the Aachen outbreak, but this strain was particularly infectious. From Aachen, the disease spread in all directions. Dancing plague soon showed up in Cologne, Flanders, Franconia, Hainhut, Metz, Strasbourg, Tongeren, and Utrecht. The plague now made it to the Low Countries before spreading south into Luxembourg and even Italy. In Italy, doctors attributed the dancing to the bite of a spider, particularly a species of small tarantula known as the Lycosa tarantula, or the tarantula wolf spider. This spider is native to southern Italy. Doctors told patients they needed to wriggle or shimmy to try and move the toxins from the bite out of the body. The right kind of music would help the stricken dance the proper motions that would ultimately neutralize the poison. These incidents were not confined to 1374. In 1381, there was a notable outbreak in the city of Augsburg. In 1428, a monk danced himself to death in the city of Schlieffenhausen. Year after year, city after city, it seemed as though the dancing plague was marching just as swiftly as the Black Death itself. The spread of this phenomenon resulted in the outbreak of not just a dancing plague, but the dancing plague. While dance mania was taking Europe by storm, it was one outbreak that sticks out in history, and it is one that is so heavily documented that it is undeniable that it actually occurred. The dancing plague of 1518 struck the city of Strasbourg, 235 miles south of Aachen, where these events got their start over a century prior. The Strasbourg dancing mania incident was the largest and deadliest of its kind. The Great Dancing Plague outburst began in July of 1518 in the center of the city of Strasbourg. A woman by the name of Frau Trophäa began to dance uncontrollably in the streets. At this point, dancing mania was a well-documented phenomenon, and seeing it strike a person down was hardly anything to be concerned about. After all, it had been 144 years since the Aachen incident, so one lady shaking it in the streets wouldn't have garnered a second glance. But this case was different, as we will see. For some reason, Frau Trophäa's undulations attracted the attention of the city in an era when it should have been the most mundane thing in the world to see. According to the writer Ned Pennant Rea, the events began like this. He writes, quote, Frau Trophäa had started dancing on July 14th on the narrow cobbled street outside of her half-timbered home. As far as we can tell, she had no musical accompaniment, but simply began to dance. Some of those who witnessed her strange performance began to mimic her, and within days more than 30 choreomaniacs were in motion, some so monomaniacally that only death would have the power to intervene. End quote. Pennant Rea points out that Frau Trophäa began dancing without musical accompaniment. In some cities, officials ordered musicians to join the streets, hoping that music would hasten the end of the dancing, or help those believed to be suffering from possession or illness. In some cases, the music caused the crowds to disperse, but in other cases, music caused the crowds to swell. In this case, there was no music at all. At least, not yet. Frau Trophäa wasn't in the mood to dance for an hour, or an afternoon, or a day. Frau Trophäa was determined to dance until her body gave out. Multiple accounts attest that Frau Trophäa danced for a week straight. What started as a regular oddity morphed into something more. The fact that Trophäa's endurance was notable means that many other outbreaks of dancing mania must not have lasted for quite as long. Trophäa's week-long dancing spree caused multiple others to join in, and by the end of the week, there were dozens of people dancing alongside of her. By the end of July, there were hundreds. Strasbourg was paralyzed by hundreds of manic dancers. They clogged the streets, they grouped up in circles on the corners, they distracted passerbys, and blocked the way of merchants trying to enter and leave the city. It must have been a wild and chaotic scene, that is hard to imagine today. A city packed with people dancing uncontrollably and seemingly against their will proves that fact is often stranger than fiction. But this is where our story takes a turn for the macabre. Up until now, this reads like a campy historical drama, a strange but heartwarming oddity. People liked to dance during this time, and perhaps they were bored or wanted to add their movements to the seemingly futile world around them as a protest or means of catharsis. Perhaps these people wanted to be part of something or join into a movement. Perhaps they just wanted an excuse to get out of work. Sorry, boss, can't run the shop today. I have dancing plague. As the plague continued to grip the city, it became clear that something more nefarious was going on than first seemed. In Strasbourg, where dancing mania transforms into the dancing plague, this is where the dancing becomes deadly, on a massive scale. Up until this incident in Strasbourg, reports of deaths from dancing mania were scarce. There was the monk that danced himself to death decades prior, and a few accounts of dancers dying of heart attacks, but death was not a widespread effect of this disease up until this point. In fact, the Aachen outbreak didn't note anyone having died from dancing mania despite also happening on an expansive scale. Something different was about to happen in Strasbourg that turns the stomach. A week is a long time to dance, and eventually you would think that people would, stop. But they didn't. Most people can't convince themselves to work out for an hour a day, and yet these people were quite content to dance for days on end without stopping save for cramps or utter exhaustion. Either they didn't want to stop, or could not stop on their own volition. Either way, the scene became increasingly bleak. The afflicted moved in frantic, erratic fits, their bodies seized by relentless convulsions. Sweat drenched their trembling forms, soaking through their garments, as their limbs flailed with uncontrollable violence. Their eyes, hollow and unseeing, stared blankly into the void, as though their souls had already departed for the beyond. Blood, drawn by the merciless grip of gravity, pooled into their swollen and battered feet, until it seeped into their shoes. Desperate cries for mercy sometimes pierced the air, though many were too far gone to beg for relief. If their tormented hearts did not give out, exhaustion would claim them instead, driving them to collapse, spent and starving, their bodies hollowed by thirst and fatigue. Those swept up in this particular bout of plague refused to eat. They could force some water down their throats as their muscles began to cramp, but they never stopped to have an actual meal. Those who collapsed were offered food and succor, but as soon as their strength returned, they returned to dancing. The dancing plague took a turn for the worse in early August. At the height of the disease, it is said that 15 people a day were dying. That would have put the death toll of the dancing plague between 400 and 600 persons. Those numbers are alarming. That means that someone was dropping dead about once per hour and being hauled away to be buried. In a city with hundreds of unwilling dancers, that number seems plausible, probable even. This outbreak was taking place during the height of summer, and there were no fans or air conditioners to cool these people down. In fact, some accounts specifically say that many of the dancers were falling ill and dying of heat exhaustion and from overheated blood. Having hundreds of people die because they can't stop dancing will certainly raise an eyebrow, and it has. The incident remains one of the most enigmatic in history, and people are still fascinated by this account, partially because of the sheer number of people who allegedly died. I say allegedly because there has been some pushback on the death toll. Some say that not many people died at all, and the numbers have been overblown throughout history in order to increase the incident's notoriety. The city of Strasbourg kept detailed records of the dancing plague, but the city records did not include any notes about deaths or casualties. That is not to say there weren't any, but they didn't make it into the official record. Despite that, the historical sources agree on many points. The city records clearly state that there was an outbreak of dancing mania. The dancing began when a single woman, unnamed in the city's account, began to dance. The dancing did not seem to die down, and it lasted such a long time that it attracted the attention of the authorities. The authorities tried numerous ways to get the dancing to stop. They tried the old trick of adding music, but Strasbourg was one of those cities where the music only seemed to make the problem worse and not better. The council then decided to ban music altogether, hoping that the silence would dissuade the dancing. but the dancing continued. Then the city council gave up authority to a group of local physicians studying the afflicted. The physicians told the patients to, quote, dance themselves free of it, and explained to the city that this was something that was going to have to work itself out. So the council turned to their last method of recourse. When in doubt, pray it out. If the doctors could not find a way to end the plague, and with bodies allegedly piling up in the streets, something had to be done. In September, the city had quite enough of this particular strain of dancing plague. The dancers were rounded up, thrashing and fighting, and forcibly sent to a shrine in the hills outside of the city. The dancers were then placed in red shoes, sprinkled with holy water, and had a cross painted on them. Then they were subjected to a sort of exorcism in front of the statue of none other than Saint Vitus, where they were forced to clutch crosses in their hands and be bathed in incense and Latin phrases for the health of their souls and the safety of the community. The fun was seemingly over. Those who returned from the mountain shrine attested that they had been forgiven by Saint Vitus and were now free of the dancing plague. Once a few people were cured, the groups began to disperse. By mid-September, the outbreak had nearly burned itself out, and by the end of the month, it was over. Sending the dancers to church seemingly did the trick. So does that mean that the plague was divine or supernatural in origin? There are a number of potential explanations for the outbreak of dancing mania during the medieval ages. Like all good mysteries, there are multiple plausible explanations, and there are people that can and have argued their case for each one of these. At the end of the day, we don't really know what caused this particular behavior. It happened too long ago. We don't understand the exact combination of social factors that were in the air at the time, and we don't know the attitudes of regular people towards the dancers themselves. We also don't have any bodies that we can autopsy to see if these people were under the effects of a psychedelic or a disease. Pretty much all of the information we have has been summarized here. With that being said, these are the most common and plausible explanations for the dancing plague. The entire dance mania craze could have been caused by a simple religious fervor. We already discussed the cult of Saint Vitus and how he was popular and associated with dancing. Some experts simply suggest that dance mania was a way to try and appease or gain favor from Saint Vitus. As mentioned, somehow Vitus became vengeful and was given the power to curse and smite. That doubles the potential for Saint Vitus to be the subject of particular behaviors. People could have been dancing to gain Vitus's favor, or they could have been dancing to ward off Vitus's ire. There might have even been a widespread cult of Saint Vitus that was spreading its message throughout Europe, whose existence has been lost or misconstrued throughout time. The theory of religious fervor has a few things going for it. First, religious fervor, cults, and superstition were super common during this time and in this particular location. The idea that people could be dancing to stay the wrath of God or appease a certain saint is more than plausible. We have a popular saint associated with dance, an uncontrollable movement. And we have a time period when the wrath of God felt very near, and the saints were unhappy with the state of affairs in Europe. However, there is no concrete record that can tie these incidents to a particular religious movement, so this theory is highly circumstantial, even if it makes sense. We cannot talk about something unexplainable in the past without bringing up ergot. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye, and develops when rye gets too damp and sits in certain weather conditions. It is often used as an easy and somewhat lazy explanation for anything unexplainable by modern audiences. Ergot is often called St. Anthony's fire, and it has been used to explain everything from the Salem witch trials to the terror during the French Revolution. When ingested, ergot can cause an illness in people, which results in muscle spasms, vomiting, hallucination, and extreme pain. Everyone likes to hone in on the hallucination aspect while ignoring the others. It would be hard for people to dance themselves to death if they were also puking out their guts. Similarly, proponents of ergot never account for why hundreds of people would somehow end up with the same hallucination that caused them all to dance. That must have been a coincidence. While there are documented outbreaks of ergot poisoning in medieval Europe, I don't like defaulting to blaming ergot just because one of its potential side effects is hallucination. It makes modern people seem lazy because they don't want to do the work to dig into the factors that could have caused dancing mania outside of a convenient fungal mold. but I digress. Ergot could have played into some of the smaller outbreaks of dance mania, which could have established some sort of social aspect to it before it spread. But ergot cannot be used to explain the large and widespread incidents of dance mania as a whole, and definitely cannot account for the size of the outbreak in Strasbourg. Perhaps the most plausible explanation for both dance mania and the dancing plague itself is mass hysteria. Mass hysteria has a few characteristics that absolutely could have manifested in medieval Europe. Some components of mass hysteria include people typically believing something specific has triggered their symptoms, which could have been a curse, sin, God, or the plague. They didn't have an underlying health condition that could prompt these symptoms, which rules out ergot poisoning or some similar ailment. People suffering from mass hysteria wouldn't behave in this way normally, which we can see by how dance mania comes and goes but never sticks around for long. And these people might share an extreme fear of an exaggerated or non-existent threat. Again, this could have been sin, hell, or the Black Death. Experts also recognize two distinct forms of mass hysteria: mass anxiety hysteria and mass motor hysteria. Mass anxiety hysteria tends to show up among people who belong to the same, often isolated group. It involves sudden tension or anxiety, which spreads and resolves reasonably quickly. The second type is mass motor hysteria. This type tends to show up among people experiencing long-term stress and anxiety. It involves irregular movement symptoms that move from person to person gradually and often linger for weeks. Mass motor hysteria seems to fit the bill perfectly for dance mania. The long-term stress would have been social upheaval due to the Black Death and the seemingly arbitrary nature of the death stalking the land, and that resulted in irregular movements that lingered for days or weeks. It seems as though we have found our culprit. And while mass motor hysteria seems to check all of the boxes for both dance mania and the dancing plague itself, there are still a couple of other things that might also fit the same box. This is perhaps the most plausible explanation, but it might not be the correct one. Similar to mass hysteria is a mass social contagion. A social contagion is different in that people join in not due to stress or trauma, but because everyone else is doing it. One person starts dancing, and then a second person shrugs and says, "Why not? I'll dance too." And then a third person sees their friend dancing and joins in, and before you know it, there are 30 people dancing, and then 60, and so on. Social contagions often start benignly enough, but can quickly spiral out of control. People could have dropped dead because they didn't want to be seen as the first person to stop dancing. Social contagions often result in massive social pressures, and some people are extremely susceptible to social pressure. It is hard to tell if the dancing plague or any of the dancing manias were social contagions or mass hysteria. It could have been a combination of both. On paper, looking at it from 500 years away, both of these things look similar. What caused the outbreak of dancing? Was it trauma or some kind of new social stew that we were not privy to in 2025? It is impossible to say with any certainty. One simple explanation is that the whole dancing mania thing was a fake. The people knew what they were doing, and they staged the whole thing. These people were not dancing uncontrollably. They were very much in control of their faculties. This would not be the first mass incident to be faked for various reasons. There is a theory that the girls who had claimed to be tortured by demons and witches during the Salem witch trials had faked all of their symptoms just to get a rise out of the community to disastrous effect. The fraud theory would require a very low death toll from the dancing plague, which some people adhere to. If no one actually died in Strasbourg, then the idea that the whole thing was staged becomes more likely. If dozens of people actually died, it would disqualify the fraud theory, as many people wouldn't die for such an obvious lie. It is also not clear what the motivation would be: attention from the church, a political message, some unknown goal attainable only within Strasbourg in particular. We don't know. And the line between a total fraud and a social contagion is also extremely thin. Perhaps the original Frau who started dancing was a fraud, but the rest of the people who joined in were simply being affected by the social contagion. Lastly, we might want to consider that dance mania was the result of something unexplainable or lost to history. This answer is unsatisfactory to lay people and experts alike, but it has to be considered. If there is something that we are not aware of, or something that has been lost to time, it is folly to try to cram other solutions into a box that no longer exists. We might never really know what caused dance mania, or it could have been a combination of everything mentioned previously. Maybe it was something supernatural. Maybe it was a curse. Maybe it was God. Maybe it was something else entirely, an actual plague whose microbes have long gone extinct. There's a good chance we'll never know. Sometimes you won't get all of the answers in this life, and you have to be okay with that. Socrates famously uttered the line that the only thing he knew for certain was that he knew nothing at all. He understood that the many mysteries of life were oftentimes incomprehensible. It is an attitude that has been completely lost today. Modern people demand an answer for everything, and when none are forthcoming, they invent them for themselves. The dancing plague remains mysterious, and maybe the reason for that is because the causes have truly been lost, are incomprehensible, or are ultimately unexplainable. So is dancing mania a form of devotion gone wrong, a curse, a symptom of something deeper in the medieval psyche, or is it something completely unknown or unknowable? The truth is lost to time, just like the dancers themselves. But one thing is clear, whether in celebration or affliction, the people kept moving, unable to stop, bound by forces beyond their control. And that is history, once forgotten and now found. Thank you for joining me on this strange journey through history. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a rating, and share it with fellow history lovers. Have a theory of your own about the dancing plague, or a medieval mystery you'd like to hear about next? Let me know at forgottenandfoundpodcast.com or grantpiperwriting.medium.com. This was episode 8 of our first season, which means that there are just 2 episodes left until the big rework for season 2, which will drop in late March. That season will cover Weird World War II. If you have stayed on this long, thank you. And until next time, be good and God bless.